It is a little bit. But on the topic of things that we're missing and actually thinking about, this is a wonderful transition. I want to take a moment and talk to you about service businesses, right? It's what you do, it's how you spend your time in the world. And obviously for the last couple of years, you've been focused primarily on productizing businesses, not just service businesses, but product businesses as well. What's the most counterintuitive truth about service businesses that most owners miss, most founders miss? What is it that they're not thinking about?
I think the most counterintuitive thing is something that's true in many people's heads, is that being nice to someone is in some way encouraging them to be nice back. I think that's fundamentally what underpins a lot of the challenges that service businesses tend to face, is that they try to keep their customers happy in ways that are detrimental to themselves, and they assume that the customer notices that, appreciates it, and will pay back that niceness at some point in the future.
How did we get to that point? Like, if you don't mind me being candid, it's ridiculous. All the agencies do sometimes is people please, right? And I get it from a share of revenue perspective, but the actual value that they're adding is not in being appreciated, right?
I think it's a normal human nature type thing to try to be nice to people. I think that's generally where people start from. What they don't initially realise is that unless there's some boundaries around that niceness, they will very quickly fall into a pattern of being used as opposed to being respected. I think that's one of the challenges, certainly. Kieron, go on.
Well, maybe I'm a little bit more cynical. Surprise, surprise. I don't know that it's necessarily being nice. I think it's that they believe if the customer is happy, that the customer will stay longer, and that's not a illogical conclusion, right? That if my customer is happy, then they will stay my customer for longer. That's the intent, and it's not just about being nice. It's about trying to make sure that the customer stays. But in the process of trying to make a customer happy, you end up giving away a lot of value, and things that have no price by definition have no value. And so the wanting to give things away to make a customer happy is often what causes, they say familiarity breeds contempt. I think that is often the case with clients.
I think it's a misunderstanding that we see in a lot of places. I think that there's without the respect aspect to it, you're never going to be happy anyway, because it leads to some other aspects, in particularly that we see in the marketing services space, where customers don't feel the tension in the relationship. Mm-hmm. They say to their agency, "We want this," and the agency goes, "That's great, I'll go and do it." Whereas what really the customer is looking for is some tension in that relationship to go, "Is that really the best thing we could be doing? There's another idea I've had. Could we talk about that as well? Or let's put it in the mix of other things that we're doing and look at it as a whole." They don't feel that tension. They feel it's a little bit too passive, which comes back to the sort of people-pleasing behaviour, which bizarrely never actually pleases people. It's called people-pleasing, but what it's actually doing is behaving in a submissive sort of manner, which it doesn't tend to generate long-term happy relationships.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think there's some research company in the US that does an annual survey. I read it for this year, and annoyingly they've dropped the question, but last year they had a question about what was the number one reason why a brand would change agencies. Mm-hmm. And the number one reason that was given was lack of proactivity.
Do you see that? Do you think we see that a lot more today compared to 5-10 years ago?
I think it's been progressively getting worse for a much longer period than that. And I think you can track it to if you and here it's the research is advertising agencies. I think if you could track the trajectory of advertising agencies versus management consultancies, you would see that over 30 odd years, advertising agencies have been in decline in terms of their position with their clients. They used to be in the boardroom. Now they're lucky if they're dealing with a CMO. So they're being driven down in terms of the relationships that they have within their clients. they've become a lot less important.
And so like that is, we've talked about this before, right? Where it's the Mad Men concept, and it's changed, where that was really great of having these individuals at every layer of a company, right? These account executives that would work together. And that's slowly been taken away. Why did that happen? Is there like a fundamental change in culture? Was it a fundamental change in advertising? How, like, what happened there?
I think there was a fundamental change in the advertising model. So in the days of Mad Men, all the money was made out of the advertising. So the agency would bulk buy advertising from media channels. They would get a discount for buying the volume. They would bundle that media buying with the creative and sell those ideas to clients. And it was quite profitable to do that. So you could give away some of the creative ideas because you would make the money back on the advertising.
Mm-hmm.
But the model changed in the early to mid 80s. The model changed and the advertising industry switched to a FTE model where people bill out for hours or days of people's time. So it focused on the inputs rather than the outputs. And I think that kicked off a series of changes in terms of how agencies made their money. We saw a separation of creative from media. So agencies started to be split into creative and media agencies. And then to layer on top of that, technology came along. So the internet came along. How you bought advertising changed. Google advertising meant that people could directly access the advertising themselves. So I think progressively the agencies, instead of working to buy the advertising placement, they switched to trying to make their money off the production. Advertising production became the way in which they made their money. So they turned up with an idea, a concept, they'd pitch with a concept. The concept would win. They wouldn't make money off the concept, but they would hope to recoup the money through all the operational stuff that came from running campaigns.
What's the real cost of all of that, of pivoting to this time-based billing approach?
I think it seemed quite a good idea at the time, but I think over time it's turned out to be a bad idea because ultimately agencies have become detached from the outcomes. You know, if you're billing for the inputs, you're less focused on the outcomes.
Do you think they knew that at the time?
No, I don't think so. I think it's kind of gradually happened. It's, you know, as they've gone and looked, I don't think they would say, yeah, you know, it's our business plan to devalue what we do. I think it's just happened over time. And those behaviors have become so ingrained in the industry over time that it's just become the way in which the business works.
Can I go back oh, sorry, Andrew, go on.
I was just going to add there that I don't know that necessarily agencies were left with an awful lot of choice, because most agency leaders tend towards wanting to work with bigger clients.
Mm-hmm.
Bigger clients mean bigger logos. Bigger logos means more esteem as an organization. And those bigger organizations were the ones that led the change away from the 15% plus model to the time materials model. So working with those bigger clients meant shifting to a time materials based model. The disadvantage was it completely inverted the team structure that was able to work on a client, because previously there would have been a lot of account handlers working across a client when compared to the number of people actually doing creative work. And that was because they wanted to make sure the customer was investing the right way, and that meant that they had to put a lot of investment into account management to achieve it. When the client started paying for people to do just the actual work, the actual chargeable work for the client, they didn't want to pay for all this account handling. To them, that was a waste.
Mm-hmm.
So as a consequence, they got rid of all of that. They didn't want that anymore. They just wanted to now buy the creative people's time to actually do the advertising work. So if we come back around to passive behaviors versus active behaviors, the agency went from being active and working on behalf of the client to achieve the client's goals. I'm unsure which department within Shell that did the original deal was running that one, but I wouldn't mind betting it was somebody in one of the groups in procurement who came up with the idea that these agencies...
But it's the problem to all everything, it seems.
Well, you know, they definitely have a very positive and also very negative way of doing things when they when they can. But the fundamental change then was the power shifted from the agency into the client to decide what sort of marketing to do, because you're now just buying bodies to sit in seats to do stuff that need to be told to do. The account
Is that a good thing? Is that shift, was that positive, or was that actually a negative to how marketing gets done?
I'd imagine for the first people who went through that process, it was extremely positive for some period of time, because I would bet the agency still put on all the account handling team because that was the only way they knew how to operate. So they still kept all that cost, but just accepted they would get lower fees against all the people doing the work. The trouble was that was not a sustainable model. So that all eroded away. The power sort of shifted from the agency back towards the client, but with the best will in the world, clients aren't marketing specialists. And if you want to buy a marketing specialist, go and buy one. If you want marketing people, go and do that, but don't try to confuse the two.
I agree with that, and I think that's a really important dimension of what has changed. So in the mid, late 80s, early 90s, pre-digital, you could have somebody in-house in your marketing team, a brand manager, who pretty much knew the full scope of marketing. And it was not a science. That's not quite right. There were academic papers being published. The American Marketing Association did a lot of research. It was progressively becoming more scientific in its approach, but it wasn't a hard data science like it often is today. And so if you had a good marketing manager who knew what they wanted, they could direct an agency to do things that they wanted, and it would deliver good results. And probably, yes, there would have been specialists in agencies who could have done a better job in certain places. But overall, I think if you were directing the resources as a marketing manager in a brand, you could probably get reasonable outcomes. But things have become much, much more complex now. It's much more scientific, a lot more data-driven, a lot more software-driven. The scope of marketing today is enormous. You can't be good at everything. And so I think things have started to come unstitched as, people... There's definitely the case. We're looking at, I was looking at an interview that you did with Briefly.
Yeah.
Where they were talking about one of the problems is marketing people, when they're writing the brief, don't want to admit that they don't know the subject matter, right?
Yeah.
They kind of bullshit their way through the brief.
For me, that was an incredible realization, just sitting there and understanding that sometimes the people creating the brief or working on the briefs aren't the specialist for that specific area.
Yeah.
And they also don't have the ability to talk to what great briefs look like. And they don't have that senior marketeer within their organization that they can constantly just communicate with. And it feels like this vacuum that they exist in. And so as a result, you get these poor marketing campaigns, you get these poor marketing ideas. And that seems like a problem that can be solved with technology. And on that, what do you think about how tech has proliferated into marketing and made it more of a science versus an art?
I have mixed views on this. So it's good in one way that everything is a lot more measurable and, you can experiment, you can take a scientific approach to it. But I think we've kind of also lost something in the art side of marketing, and we've moved a lot more to performance marketing. It's easier to sell performance marketing into your own organization than brand marketing because it's a lot easier to track. There are applications and software to do just about anything. There's a lot of data available. So there's a lot more things that you can do in the world of digital. But I did see some quite interesting research. I think it was published in Marketing Magazine about the impact of digital marketing and on marketing ROI, so the return on dollars spent.
Mm-hmm.
That it actually around 2009, I think it was, there was actually a decline in marketing ROI. So this is as social media came along, YouTube, there were a lot more channels. There was a bunch of experimentation going on. And in fact, it took 10 years. It wasn't until 2019 that marketing ROI returned to the level it was in 2008. So, and the reason for that was There was so much new stuff to do, so much experimentation, money being put behind things that just didn't work. It took 10 years for marketing to actually learn how to use all of these new tools and channels properly.
We're definitely going to have a conversation about this. I'm just thinking about the application of AI in that 10-year period now. And you think about all of the problems, all the mistakes that they've gone through, that have trained the models, that hopefully in the future we'll get to a point where actually your average Joe that wants to start a business can quite quickly do performance marketing and doesn't need a specialist to do that. But I want to take a step back for a moment. Both of you have spent time in the marketing services area of marketing and technology. And obviously a few good people does a very specific thing. You've productized your own business. What was that first moment when you realized that actually there is a problem with how service businesses operate for yourselves? Was it when you were in a company and you were looking at it and thinking, the way that we do this is wrong, our processes are messed up, we're losing money here? Or was it something where you're just sitting on a beach drinking a glass of wine and it just popped into your head and realized it was true?
I guess the problem already existed when I joined, as it was then, Cognified, which eventually got rolled up into Wunderman Thompson and VML and WPP and a lot of other three-letter initialisms that the advertising world uses.
Andrew, on that, why do you think they use three letters? I still haven't figured it out. It's always three.
No idea.
Well, there was VMLY&R.
Yeah, true.
Okay, going in primes, I'm not too sure, but go on, please.
Yeah, so I got into the marketing realm because the two founders of Cognified, as it was back then, had a particular offering and didn't think they were making enough money from it. They didn't think it was valued well enough by clients. So they wanted someone to come in and work out what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I ended up inside Cognified, was helping to fix that particular little challenge.
Did you know it was a problem prior to joining Cognified?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily...
Or have you observed it?
I wouldn't describe it as a problem. It's more an opportunity. So I think it's not that you can't run a business without productizing it. So productization is a choice. It's not a mandatory thing you must do. It's a way of doing things which has a particular effect, and if you want to have that particular effect, you've got to productize this. It's just kind of the way of the world. So it's more, I would describe it as more like a philosophical choice than it is a sort of rule of thumb. So have we seen this in other places? Yes. In my history, I've seen it in numerous places where you go, it'd be just better if we tweaked that thing so it looked a bit more like this versus like that. Rather than thinking of productization as like a linear process or a fixed maturity curve where you must do this and then you must do that, there are lots of ways in which productization can happen inside an organization without it necessarily being labeled as productization. So, be that doing simple things like putting together a price catalog, so you've got a list of all the things you do and having a price against them, is an aspect of productization. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're fully productizing everything. It just means you've been a bit more ordered in what you do for clients and how you run your internal processes. And if you had that, I would say if you actually had an internal self-improvement process in place, you've got quite a lot of productization already happening by default, because you just need to be self-aware of how you do things, making sure you repeat those things in a way that's reusable and that's valuable, and then just keep improving that process, and you will get yourself towards being much more productized than you were before. That's not necessarily innate to all people's ways of doing things or styles of business. So I think
I'm curious, why was Cognified not set up like that, given the work that they used to do in web and digital? I would think Sunny worked there. And when I was putting together the question list for this and doing the research, I was thinking, why did they have that opportunity in the first place for you to come in and then obviously build out a productized service catalog?
So I'm going to give you a small anecdote from when I joined, which will give you a flavour as to why they hadn't done it before. So I came in, I had a look at this portfolio of things they asked me to look after, and I went over to it wasn't one of the founding directors, it was someone else, one of the other people there, and I said, I'm going to productize this stuff. I now understand what it's about, and I'm going to move it from where it is today, where everything's handmade, all to work or handwritten, pricing's completely invented from arbitrary sort of assumptions that are made. I'm going to move all of that away, and I'm going to have a standardized price list of all the things we do that we offer to all clients. And there's going to be a standard statement of work, and we're going to basically convert this all into a marketing deck that we actually going to take to customers rather than wait for customers to ask us to do something. And the response I got was, that's impossible, because everything we do for customers is unique. And I think that there's, and to some extent they were right, but also that's only true if you don't know what you're looking for when you're doing the productization process. So what appears to one person to be completely random acts, to another person who can look at it and start to see patterns in the behaviors, that means you can start to put some order in place. And once you've got that level of order in place, you can put some more order in place, and order starts to come about through that exercise.
Why are you able to see those patterns? What in your history, what in your background allows you to do that?
I don't know, it's like reading the Matrix. You just look at stuff and you go, I can see that's common, that's common, that's common. Let's group that up and get it started. And it's a ball rolling problem to start with, right? You've got to get something productized, then you start to see other patterns appear because you've productized something.
And it's that snowball effect.
Yes, but there's another aspect to it, which coming back around to a conversation at the beginning about being reactive versus proactive. Productization becomes self-reinforcing once you've started the process. So if you imagine, let's use a restaurant analogy. Let's say you went into a restaurant that didn't have a menu, and you just walked in, and the waiter came over and just listed a bunch of ingredients and a list of equipment in the kitchen. The chances of any two orders being the same is negligible, because everybody will pick the individual ingredients in the individual volumes they wanted them done. They would pick the individual bits of equipment they chose to build whatever meal they've happened to have concocted. So the chances of productization are almost nil, because you've got so much random sort of disorder occurring at the front end of the process, because you've gone to the customer and you started with a blank sheet of paper and said, what would you like? Which opens a can of worms to anything that the customer can possibly think of. If you invert that to the way a normal restaurant tends to work, it gives you a menu. It says, proactively, these are the things we've designed that we know we can do really well. Would you like one? And from that, you get a reasonable quantity of choices to make that will fulfill whatever desire you happen to have within the bounds of the restaurant that you're in, right? So the menu structure, that sort of productized approach to presenting customers with options, is in broad terms a more positive experience than just turning up and saying, what would you like?
Mm-hmm.
It's a more constructive process. The second thing it would do is it presents you as an expert, because you've spent the time designing some stuff that you think other people like. So you're now in a more expert sort of situation. And it's not without its tailoring. You still tweak bits and pieces within the menu structure, and you can ask for the Caesar salad without the anchovies on top, or whatever option you may happen to choose to mildly customize what's on the menu. But largely you stick to what's on there. And that creates a positive customer experience, but it also means the kitchen's got some ability to repeat things, which makes them efficient at doing what they do, and means there's some consistency in the outcomes they deliver to customers, and they can be confident that when they make a Caesar salad, the next one will be the same, the next one will be the same, and if they choose to change it, they change it for all people at the same time. So there's a bit of rigor applied to it. Sorry, that was quite a long answer to that question.
It also implies better quality, right? Because, I've never been to a kebab shop that does great Thai food,
Mm-hmm.
Or even, when you look at a Chinese takeaway and, they have Chinese dishes, which already is quite a huge range.
It's a lot of dishes.
And then there's the inevitable Thai selection, and you're like,
oh, don't forget the Indo-Chinese as well, and then that Malaysian
exactly.
flavor that gets thrown in.
And unless you're very lucky, they will never be the best dishes you've ever had in your life, right? If you want to go to if you love Thai food, you'll go to a Thai restaurant, because it's not just about the ingredients, it's also about their skill and experience in Thai food. And that's why restaurants do this. People will think, what do I feel like? Do I want Thai? Do I want Indian? They're already thinking in those terms. They're not thinking, I want generic food.
No, when you break it down to that restaurant analogy, and I love that, it makes it so simple. Why would I walk into a restaurant and ask for the ingredients? Or I wouldn't want to be given a menu of ingredients. I would want to be given the menu dishes that I could then ask, oh, can we do this slightly differently in reference to the Caesar salad? I'd love to ask, productization obviously is a complex statement, and we've kind of boiled it down to it's this iterative process. You've got to get the ball rolling. How do you explain it to someone that's just done billable hours their entire life?
That's a very good question. I think the starting point is that you are wanting to find a way to explain what you do to customers in terms of the value you deliver, not in terms of the time you spent doing it. So for me, it almost comes back to that analogy. And that's the way I find I tend to explain it to people who don't understand, because productization is not a great word, to be fair.
No, honestly, when I first heard about what you were doing, when we were having our first conversations, but all of us, when you said productization, I thought you were a tech company that walked into marketing businesses and went, this is how you take software and implement it into your business. And we basically turn all of those workflows into agents and off we go, right? It's just technology at its core. But actually, as I've come to understand it, it is a psychological change that you have to make.
Yes. So I tend to explain it in terms of that analogy of operating in two separate spheres, and Kieron no doubt have a piece on this too. For me, if we take the purely human aspect of it, starting point, the productization process is about communicating what you do to clients in a way that they will understand, where they will perceive the value of what you're doing for them. So that menu structure is all about creating a means of communication using language that the customer understands, but which you can use internally to manage your internal processes. So there's an external part to it, facing customers and communicating with them and making them understand what you do and why it's important to them. And then there's a second part, which, if I stick to the human aspect of it, which is the people doing the work on the inside. It is easier for them to do the work if the customer understands what it was that was being asked for in the first place. So many times, if you don't have clear language on the outside of your business, your internal language and your internal service delivery becomes very confused, and as a consequence becomes much more difficult to manage. Which, if you take the marketing services space, is why there's lots of people running around saying, oh, well, an agency should only have 20 clients. Well, it's because you're doing random stuff on the outside, which is really difficult to deliver on the inside. Nobody's got any common language to use because you're inventing it every time you talk about it. And as a consequence, you can't cope with more than 20 because it just gets too confusing. If you have some common language, then that will definitely help make sure that you're communicating your value to customers, but also the people internally, when they are talking about a particular deliverable, have a common name for it, and therefore everybody knows what they're talking about.
How often do you see that the language is the main barrier between agencies and clients and not being able to communicate effectively?
That's a very, very significant percentage of the time, I would say.
So most of the time, like the client is having a conversation with the agency and they think they're saying the same thing, and in reality, it's different.
Yes, I've even seen it to the extent where the customer believes they are buying a business transformation and the agency thinks they're delivering a website. You can get to that level of disconnection between the two parties, and then there's a great deal of upset. Hundreds of thousands of pounds disappear down the plug hole, but as the two parties argue about the fact that the starting principles for the entire project were just completely off, but nobody dared question it because it was not in line with winning new business.
It even happens within layers within the client as well. So, at Cognified, we were doing software development. So inevitably, we end up working with the IT people in the client organization, and there would be situations where what the IT department was asking us to build was not what the marketing department wanted. So you've got several layers of abstraction or Chinese whispers going on between various parties.
But is that not an effective product strategist or a product manager that actually is communicating internally with the rest of the org to try and understand what you should be building?
Yeah, I mean, there
building
is that,
for
right?
at least.
So that's why we end up developing a consulting team, because in the early days, the phrase building the wrong thing excellently was used more than once, right? We were very proud that we had built a very technically good solution. We were less concerned about whether it actually did what the client wanted, because we were just doing what the client asked us. And that got us into trouble. So we started asking questions like, why do you want this? And what are you really trying to achieve with this? And then when you ask those questions, you discover that what the client was asking for wasn't the right thing at all.
And there was a video I reminded Kieron of the other day, which illustrates this in a very comedic way. So back in the 80s, I guess, Kieron, 2000?
80s.
A little older than me. Huh?
Yeah, back in the days of slightly uncomfortable haircuts and fashion.
At least there were haircuts.
Yeah. There was a great sketch in Not the 9 o'clock News where a guy goes into a hi-fi store and he's clearly a little bit out of his depth in his purchasing process, and he comes in and he says, I'd like to buy a gramophone. And there's two sort of wide boy characters behind the counter who immediately burst out laughing and start calling him Grandad, and then start talking in a slightly patronising manner about what this person's really after. Do they want Dolby? Do they want this? And do they want that?
Woofers or tweeters.
Woofers and tweeters, and do they want a bag on their head? And do they want salad cream dressing with that? And so on. It all gets very out of hand. But it illustrates how quickly a sales situation deteriorates if you don't have a common understanding of language between the two parties. If you let the customer define the language, then you are immediately putting yourself in a secondary position. It's not that you can't be empathetic to the customer's language, but you do need to be demonstrating the fact you're an expert, and to do that you need to have some sort of language that you tend to stick to. It doesn't have to be exclusive, it doesn't have to be sort of overly flamboyant or overly inventive. It's just got to have quite specific meanings, and when people use it in an incorrect way, that needs to be corrected so that then everybody's on the same page about what's being done.
Can you walk me through what a sales conversation might look like when someone is actually selling productized services and it's done in a way that they are an expert? How does it look different from selling normal time-based materials?
So I think there's a golden rule, which is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you need to use them in that proportion. And so it's still very much listening to what the customer wants. I think the fundamental difference is in your diagnosing of what the customer is looking for. Is it, if it isn't in your kit bag already of things you already are an expert in, or it is very close to something that you already do, it is time to find another customer. That's largely the difference. Whereas if you're a services business, you will tend to listen to what the customer wants, and then you go, I know somebody who could do that, and I'll go and make up a way in which we could do that for that particular customer. So you tend to be very yes-oriented in a services-oriented business, whereas in a productized business, you tend to be more no-oriented, and you'll just find another customer that does actually want what you do. So if you take us as an example, there are times when we meet a customer and what they're looking for is not what we do, and we very quickly go, that's not what we do.
What does that look like? Could you explain, can you dive into that?
Yeah, we'd still go through the same process of trying to understand what's driving the customers, what the customer opportunity is, or what the customer problem may be that they're looking to address. But as soon as we diagnose it as being something beyond our capabilities, we would then introduce somebody else who is much better matched to that need, rather than saying, oh, actually, I know a contractor who could do that, I'll go and bring them in, because that's not what we do. And there is a risk that we become distracted by trying to correct problems from taking on what ostensibly may have otherwise looked like a good opportunity.
Do you think it puts that productization and then actually having the ability to not say yes to everything, do you think it puts that power dynamic back in the agency's hands versus the client or the end customer?
I think it allows them to be the expert. So it's back to this question of proactivity, right? Clients want you to be the expert. Hire someone to fit my kitchens. I don't want to tell them how to be a kitchen fitter. I want them to look at the room that they're going to put the kitchen in and say, okay, this is the best way to do it. That's what I'm really paying them for. I'm paying for them to come along and make this problem go away and to come up with a great result at the end. I'm not paying for somebody to learn on the job. And I think a lot of the saying yes because you see the revenue and because you believe if I say no, the customer's going to be upset with me, drives entirely the wrong behavior and creates a lot of that problem of lack of proactivity. You know, somebody saying, no, you don't want to do it that way, do it this way. Years ago, when I was a product manager in a telecoms organization, we had 3 vendors that were bidding for replacing all of the core of our network. So it was hundreds of millions worth of business. And we had these series of pitches where we quizzed them on what their product could do and couldn't do. One of them was a very, very engineering-centric French equipment manufacturer. Another one was a very product-centric American manufacturer. And the presentations were absolutely streets apart. The American product company, they had a lot of proprietary technology. They knew, they thought about problems. When we said, what about if you wanted to do this? We'd have ideas about things that we would want to do. They would say, that's not the best way of solving that problem. The best way of solving that problem would be to do this, which coincidentally was what their product did. The French engineering company, when we said, could you do it this way? Their answer would almost always be, we could build it like that, so it did it that way. So their answer was never that what you were asking for was reasonable or unreasonable. Their answer was, well, we could just build it that way for you.
Which did you go with?
We went with the American company.
Was it because it was productized?
It was partially because it was productized. Also, there was some real visual cues. Like the French equipment was horrendous looking. Like it looked horrendous. The American company's equipment was super simple. It looked like they had thought about this and they'd stripped away everything unnecessary. So both in the answers, visually, everything we went for the American product because it was extremely well articulated. It looked great. It didn't do things that we wanted because their answer was, that's not really a use case that you would come across very often. Mm-hmm. Whereas the French company was, you tell us what you want and we'll build it for you. And I'm sure they could have, but I'm also sure it would have taken a lot of time and be very expensive.
Can I ask, did you see that project through to the end? And if so, was the Americans the right choice, the American product the right choice for that?
Yes, it was.
It was. From a profitability perspective of the value it provided to the network as well as the American company, who observe that? Was it on the client to do that yourselves, or was it on the American company?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I would love to understand. One, did the American company, was it a good offer to take up? And so what they deployed into the network and what they re-engineered was good for the end customer, for the telecom customer? And if so, that value, who was that calculated by, them or you?
It was calculated by us because we had a plan to get rid of a bunch of other, our network was actually 11 networks and we wanted to collapse that down to 1. We never got to 1, but we collapsed the network down quite a lot. And so we refined a lot of our own offerings as a result. I think if we had gone the other way, we would have left in a lot of unnecessary stuff that probably didn't really have volume use cases, but would have been, we would have had built. So, I think in some ways you get forced into some choices that make you think about problems in a different way.
I mean, one of the thoughts that keeps popping into my head is when an agency works, like as someone who's been in that position of an agency pitching for business and having come from a time and materials background, not a productized background, I always revert to the client's going to be able to calculate the cost of the time. And so as a result, knows what I'm pricing it at. Can you help me unlock that? Because I'm sure that there are other people that think of it in a similar way, and then they just stick a markup on that. Obviously, the work that you do and what you're suggesting is convert to value-based pricing. What does that transition look like? Can you walk me through how I change my mindset?
So I can walk you through how did it when, and the reason I use that example is because it's end to end. You can see the entire process from beginning to end, and what happens after the productization is completed, and how improvement works. I looked at it at a few different layers. So the value problem, the naming of the service was called aftercare as a starting premise when I joined. And the first thing it made me think was aftercare was an afterthought. Now, funnily enough, that was also how it was positioned because it was always sold at the end of the project, not at the beginning of the project. Now, the purpose of this aftercare thing was you've spent several million building this new content management system. You need this thing to be operated professionally after it's gone live, because that's where the value lies, is after it's gone live. Building something doesn't bring any value. It's using it that makes value. So being named aftercare was a bit of a challenge, and the way customers perceived it was that it was low value because it was tacked on at the end. There was typically no budget available because I hadn't planned for this budget, and it also was heavily focused on the keeping the lights on part of the offer and not really on the getting the value out part. So the first thing we did was change the name to solution support because it now sounds a bit more valuable. And we also moved the time at which we'd pitch it to the beginning of the process, beginning of the project process, not moving it away from the end. And the advantage to that is that, number one, we got to secure budgets right up front rather than at the very end. So it meant there was more money available because they had time to ask for it. And the second thing it did was it improved the customer experience because it wasn't like some nasty shock after this, they've spent several million, that there's a bit more still to spend. It was all pre-planned, so there was a sort of soft moving over between the two. So from a new customer perspective, that sort of altered the journey, made things a bit better. And in doing that, we cut the service within that sort of support service offer. We cut it into three different parts. One that kept the lights on the platform. The second one that allowed the customer to improve the platform on an ongoing basis. And the third one to help them use the platform and get value from it.
How did you identify, like, splitting it up into that?
Basically by looking at the activities that people were doing on a day-to-day basis on behalf of customers, and then just assessing where the value really sat and how simply we could describe that from two different perspectives. Number one, you want to make the offer as simple as possible to not confuse things, but it needs to be complicated enough that you are extracting all the value that's potentially available from the supplier's perspective. You've got to make it simple, but you've got to make sure you explain your value too. And in that case, it turned out into three different offerings. Now, for all the new customers, that's all good, right? You can explain it from scratch, new marketing materials, this is what our support service offering looks like. For the existing customers, though, you've got to flip them from time materials already in over to these new offerings. And those new offerings were not time materials charged. They were charged out on the basis of either support points or service level agreement or a number of hours of development team capacity they were buying.
What does that conversation look like where they go, you've been charging us like this and now you're transitioning to this? How does that conversation work? Is it a positive one typically, or is it quite a negative one?
It depends. There's one particular customer that's probably worth exploring in a little bit of detail, and they were our largest customer in support services. And we were supporting a very large platform that underpinned 5,000 salespeople around the world with an iPad application, plus about 500 marketers using the platform to create content for the salespeople to present out around the world. And the journey for that particular customer was a little bit painful because the person who led that project was an ex-procurement person. So they were very good at quantifying things and trying to commoditize it down to something they could understand and benchmark against other providers. So their initial response was somewhat cynical/skeptical that this was going to work. And what they suspected was that we were going to charge them more for doing the same things. It took me about 6 weeks of analytics of their previous tickets over the past couple of years to show that in the new model, they would pay no more than they were already paying. If they asked for exactly the same amount of stuff, it would cost no more at all. And they would probably get a better service out of it because we would be signing up to service level agreements, so we would do things in very strict amounts of time, which they didn't really get before. It was a time-based model, so if things took a bit longer, it just took a bit longer. They paid more for it, and it just took longer, which is, not necessarily the ideal outcome. Whereas with this new model, we'd be fixing ourselves to a particular price point, and we'd be giving them a fixed timeline in which things would happen. So there were going to be some advantages for sure. So after about 6 weeks, I managed to persuade them that they were not going to pay anymore, and in fact, they should be getting a better service. And so they would sign a new agreement in the new structure. The oddity that came out from that, well, not an oddity, maybe they perceived it as an oddity, is that there were a few things that happened in the process. The first one is that our relationship with them got better. It wasn't particularly bad, but they were very, very oriented towards complaining or arguing about the amount of time that a particular person spent on a particular task.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they could see the data in the reporting. It said, this senior person has spent this many hours working on this ticket. And they were like, why? Why couldn't you put a junior person? Why did it have to be somebody in the UK? You could have used someone from Poland, or whatever argument we would have about that particular ticket. And largely, it was pointless discussion. In the new model, they didn't get to see any of that data. They just saw that a ticket got opened and got closed in the timeline that we said it would be, and they didn't see who had actually worked on it. And they could see how many points that particular ticket had taken, which was in line with expectations. There was nothing really to discuss. We only now focused on things that didn't work and didn't fit in with the model. All the stuff that did work and do as expected was now all quiet. So our relationship with them got significantly better because we were focused on the value we were delivering to the customer, not the amount of time taken by a particular person to do it.
And you were then communicating that value through essentially a progress indicator.
Correct.
Right. And so metrics that they could track rather than, oh, who is this person? Why are you doing that? Okay.
Yeah, so every month we had a management report that we went through with them on a telephone call. We talked about all the tickets, what they'd been, how long they'd taken, whether we'd met our own SLAs, and so on. So that was the first thing. The customer was happier, which is always a very good start. The second thing was that the employees working on that client were also happier. And the reason was there was a bit less sort of like interrogation of what their activities were, but also we were much clearer with the customer about what the expectation was. Therefore, they had a pretty strong benchmark of what their customer was supposed to be getting, so they could easily measure their work against whether they were achieving what the customer was asking for. So it was a nice, easy benchmark everybody was working to, both internally and externally.
They didn't have to communicate their value on a daily basis. They were able to say, this is what the output looks like, and we're going to achieve that.
Yes, yeah, they were able to defend the value of the service rather than having to defend their own value they personally were bringing to the client.
Yeah, that is a hard psychological thing to go through every day at work if you're doing that.
Yeah, that's painful if you've got to come feel like you're justifying your own existence on a daily basis. The second thing that happened was the customer actually spent more in aggregate. So we didn't charge them anymore, but they asked for more things to be done. Because they could now see the value, when they wanted something extra, it was clear this was an extra. It's not something that was included. There were very tight boundaries around what we said we were going to do. But because they understood those boundaries, they were always very happy to pay for more.
Right.
They actually spent an awful lot more over the following year than they did in the previous two, simply because they could now see what they were going to get, and they liked what they got, so they just bought more of it. So
okay,
they increased their revenue spend with us. The third thing it did was it enabled us to be a lot more efficient about how we delivered the work for the customer.
Mm-hmm.
So we honed our processes, honed our structures, built more automation, and so on and so on. And over about a 6-month window, we improved our margins from about 65% to about 82%, all whilst keeping the customer happier and getting them to spend more money and having happier employees. So it's a worthwhile journey going on if you can persuade people to buy something that is productized, if it is something that's useful when it's productized. And not everything is. I think some people think that productisation is the panacea that everybody should be aiming towards, and I don't think that's true. It's useful for some stuff, and it's actually quite a lot of stuff, but it's not true for everything. Even within a business, within one business, some stuff should be charged on a time and material basis and some stuff probably shouldn't.
Like explicitly, what would that look like for the stuff that isn't productized?
There are some. Go on.
High value advisory work is one of those.
So consulting.
Yeah, I think, and maybe not. There's consulting where you solve a problem and you could
Hmm.
charge on the resolution of a problem, but where you want to have a more open discussion around, developing a strategy or something like that, I don't think there's anything wrong with paying an expert for their time.
So, like for lawyers, for example, they are typically charged on an hourly basis. Are you saying that some of that work could be productized,
I
i.e.,
think a lot of that work will be productized.
right? And how does it look from a marketing services perspective? What in that realm would not be productized?
There are some aspects of what happens in marketing that aren't easy to productize. Let's put it that way. So
Like,
if you take project management,
mhm.
it's not that easy to productize it simply because you can't tell quite how much a customer is going to need in a given circumstance. Because a lot of that is dependent on how the customer reacts to you, and it's not in your control. So it's quite common to charge for that on a time material basis to sort of enable the sort of the right level of governance to be applied to a particular project. Now, over time, you can work out what that looks like and you can start to productize it for an individual customer. You might get to the point of saying, look, we're just going to charge this at, let's say, 15% on top of the other services you purchased. That will cover all our project and program governance. We'll just do it at that basis. However, when you're at the beginning of a relationship, that can be a little bit difficult to identify, to be fair, because some customers are much, much more difficult and require much, much more governance than other clients. And as a consequence, you need different ratios. And it's probably easiest to start with the time materials and move towards something more productized on an individual client than start with something productized and get it completely wrong and then have to go through the process of changing it.
Mhm.
So I think there are some aspects of individual sort of organizations' portfolios that aren't really very easy to put into a productized type bucket. Now, let me give a small caveat here. Time and materials is not just a simple commercial model. I think some people perceive it as, oh, it's just time and materials, therefore it's really easy. Even within time and materials, there are lots of ways in which you can extract more margin and present yourselves more effectively than other ways of doing things. So I'll give you an example. It's not uncommon to come across organizations that charge for their services on a blended rate sort of basis. Oh, our developers
Yeah,
are
I used to do that.
yeah, right. When you're on your own, that's kind of okay because it's just a flat rate. However, there are going to be multiple situations which will come up where you end up thinking, right, so for this project it's going to be £55 an hour. That works out on my blended rate to be 2 junior people plus 1 senior person, and that's my expectation of cost. Therefore, £55 gives me the margin I'm hoping to get, and you feel like you've productized. The trouble is
I
that
also feel like I've worked backwards from the end goal, right?
you kind of have, yeah. The disadvantage to the blended rate is the customer still has the ability to unpick the people working on that service behind you. So they still feel like they're paying for the hours, and therefore they want to qualify the quality of the hours that are being spent because you're still talking in hours. And what they will tend to do is go, oh, those junior people aren't very good. Yeah, you need to swap those out. They're not really working out very well at all. I want some more senior people who've got more experience because they're important to my project. And what you find happens is your cost base creeps up underneath you, but your price doesn't change because you've agreed a blended rate. Now, that's because you're not really talking in the value terms. All you've done is said, I've got some people, and across my expectation, it looks like this. And the customer's going to go, well, that's not my expectation. I'm expecting something else. And your ability to qualify the value and the quality of what you're delivering becomes a little bit difficult. So, in many cases, we've seen what looks like a simple time material thing go a bit kind of go off the value chart a little bit, and you end up sort of not getting what you expected out of it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to understand that metric. When you shift, because in that last conversation we were having, you talked about you changed the metric from hours to something else, and then sort of that unlock happens where we move away from time as the concept that we're billing into value. Explicitly, how does one define value? Like, I've always found that difficult myself. And so, like, what do I do to help to try and understand if I've got a service offering, how am I defining its value? It's not as simple as just look at the process, look at the people involved and add a markup? Or is it something slightly more complex than that?
I think it starts at the other end of the spectrum.
Okay.
It starts with what value is being created in the customer's head and in their business that means you can charge for it.
Right. So it's actually you have to deeply understand the customer's problems, or to a point where you can understand the value that is being associated with what you're creating.
Yes, and I think it's probably worth separating a couple of terms here. And that's probably where we've mixed those two terms up too. In product terms, you tend to talk in markets rather than customers. Services businesses, you tend to talk about customers. So, and the difference between the two is when you're thinking about what you're going to productize, you're not trying to productize it for this one customer. You're trying to productize it so that then all customers get the same service. So you're trying to think about the market and what everybody wants collectively rather than what this individual customer wants, which is the example Kieron used earlier. The American company was thinking about markets. This is how telecommunications works across the market, and I will build a product that fulfills that need. Whereas the French company was thinking, I just want to get this one customer happy and I'll invent something that will solve just their particular needs. So I think that's worth sort of separating out a little bit. Sorry, Viraj, could you refresh on the question again?
No, that kind of answered it for me in terms of the value offering. Obviously, what I understood you to say is don't look at specifically the client, the customer, look at the market and say, actually, what can I do here that is valuable for everyone, not is just valuable for this individual?
Yeah,
I think.
Do you want to talk a bit more about what value is?
Yeah, and also, what exactly does value look like?
So it can be different for every client. I'm the risk of contradicting Andrew a little bit. You can look at value at a market level, but then there are also individual circumstances that a client might have that will change the value of what they're asking for, even if they're asking for the same thing. For example, urgency. Like, I need something done, but there's a big difference between I need something done and if my standard delivery time for doing that thing is 2 weeks and the client says I must have it in 2 days, well, that's a difference in value. If the client has some urgency that means something has to be done in 2 days, the value of the thing being done in 2 days is worth more than it being done in 2 weeks. So for the same item delivered in a different time frame, it's going to be a different value.
Yes. So I don't think that's contradicting what I'm saying at all. I would describe that as you would have two different offerings. One is the standard offering, the other one is an accelerated offering. And we did have one of these for one particular client. I won't explain who it was. But we were taking large volumes of support tickets, basically, helping people use a particular system. And we charged them on the basis of the quantity of ticket, and the complexity of ticket would then be converted into a series of points. And for every ticket, there was an allocated number of points that would get burned off every month. And they could buy a certain quantity of points per month. So you buy 300 points, you burn them down during the month by asking various questions, and then you get another 300 points and so on. This particular customer wanted to have an accelerated process for a certain time of year. They said, we've got this urgent thing that needs to be done, and these people need special service. They can't cope with your normal response times. Your response times need to be really, really short for this particular period because of the urgency of the work. And we said, yeah, that's fine, we can do that. But what we're going to do is we're not going to change the commercial model, really. But for those people in that period of time, they are going to consume, I can't remember exactly what the number was, it was either 2 or 3 times as many points for every ticket that they raise. So if it was a 1-point ticket before, it's now going to be a 3-point ticket. If it was a 4-point ticket, it's now a 12-point ticket. So if you're comfortable with that, then yes, we can meet those SLAs and that'll be absolutely fine. So we agreed on that, and this happened like on a 6-month window. They'd have this little window open up, they'd have to have some urgent work, and then it would all close down and go back to normal and so on. The customer absolutely loved it, thought it was brilliant, and as did the people receiving the support. They're like, this is brilliant. During this period, you get instant answers. It's absolutely amazing, because we always met the service level agreements. Of course, we're charging, in essence, 3 times as much because we haven't changed the price per point. What we've done is increase the number of points per ticket. So we're now logically charging 3 times as much for every ticket coming through. What they didn't realise was, in fact, it took us no more effort in totality, because all we did was reshuffled the work around, so the urgent tickets at the front of the queue and the less urgent tickets were a bit further down the queue. And because we could always manage all the work anyway, it didn't actually cost us any more to do that. So the customer was very, very happy that we were inventing this service that met their exact needs. And every other customer could have it too. It just happened to be that there weren't very many other customers who wanted that level of urgency. But nonetheless, we productised it, so then it was a standard offer. They could always request it. It was easy to do. They knew exactly what the commercial model looked like. And as Kieron pointed out, we charge for in essence, the inverse of time. If you get it more quickly, it's more expensive.
Okay, I want to shift gears slightly. When is one of your clients ready, or when do they know that they're ready for productisation and walking through the methodology that you've put together from all of this work?
I think it's more about identifying that there's a problem, that, it might be they're not retaining customers, or they're not being profitable, or it's taking them too long to do something. There will be some problem. I think some clients have come to us and said, oh, I need to productize. That has been the problem that they've stated. But invariably, and I would say usually when a customer comes to us to say that they want to productize, we'll very soon find out that they don't really know what they mean by productizing. Mm-hmm. Usually it's they've encountered a problem that they don't know why it's happening, or they've not correctly diagnosed why it's happening. So there will be some other symptom that will mean that actually productization may help.
And so typically, what are the metrics that would indicate that? Profitability, time taken to deliver services, anything else?
Time taken to quote for a service.
Time taken, oh yeah, that's a good one.
I mean, that's especially the case in advertising. There's this sort of long, drawn out period of trying to figure out what they should charge for what service.
Yep, I would agree. I think there was a couple of times I would talk to the team and think, we are taking way too long on this. Like, just, it should be, we know the size of the client, we know the amount of spend that they're doing, the output of the creative is going to be X. This is on average how much it would cost.
Yeah, that would be a warning sign. If these things are taking a long time, that says that you're not particularly productized. Yeah, definitely. What we find is often people don't have a particularly clear view about which work is making them money.
Right, okay.
They might know which client is making the money, maybe. Be surprised at how many agencies don't know. They know the revenue, but they don't know whether it's actually profitable. Mm-hmm. And the first sign that they see of it is, the total profit at the end of the year or something like that, where they know that there's a problem, but maybe they don't understand.
So I guess the productization gives you that revenue clarity, right? Because you know exactly where the money's going and how it's split up.
That's one of the really big advantages that it has, is it gives you much more clarity about the things that you're doing and whether those things are making you money or not.
I think another one that comes up is the difference between sold margin and delivered margin.
Explain that to me, Andrew.
So because of the way they're producing their proposals, and they're all created in essence from the bottom up, take the cost, add some margin to it and get to a price to get to the kind of rate card and use that. When you send the proposal out, there's an assumed sales margin, i.e. worked out that on this particular deal you expect to make 45% gross margin, for example. Now, if there is a big difference between that sold margin and actually what happens when you close that particular project down at the end, then you have a problem. And quite often the problem is that the project itself isn't particularly clearly defined because it's all handcrafted and there's errors in there and assumptions aren't captured and so on, that you end up with scope creep eating away at your margin. And productisation is quite a good way of preventing scope creep, because you can be much more explicit about what you're doing, how it's going to get delivered, and therefore you can manage your margins a bit better, because you can say to the customer, well, that thing isn't on the list of things we said we were going to do, so therefore there's an incremental charge for adding that extra.
Okay, that makes sense. When you think about the resistance to productisation, is that typically quite emotional when you're talking to clients, when you're talking to customers? Talking to your clients, do they not want to do it because they don't know how to, or they don't want to do it because they don't know why they need to?
Both. And
Bit of both. Is it typically
Yeah.
more emotional?
I think so. I think there's definitely an emotional aspect to it. I think there's, it's not just emotional. It's people don't know they've always done something a certain way, and so doing something different is risky. So they feel that there's a risk to doing something that they haven't done before, and that by changing how they do something, there might be a catastrophic downside to doing it.
When you, in your business at A Few Good People, essentially productized your services, right? I was looking at the website and doing some research and trying to, how do I frame this as a question? You've got do it for you, do it with you, and do it through you. How do you help someone identify what is the right offering for them?
It largely comes down to two things. How quickly do they want something done, and what do they want to learn by going through the process of having it done? Those are the two metrics that will shift.
What do you find people do typically?
They go for the
Which one
middle
do they pick? They go for the middle one.
Almost everybody goes for the do it with you, because
Andrew, knowing you, is it set up to do that? Are your offerings set up to do that? Has it been designed that way?
a little, there is the kind of three sizes of cup of coffee approach to it, but it's also that there is almost no point building a price list, service catalog, whatever you want to call it, your offerings into a nice structure if you have no ability to manage that structure after we've left. It just doesn't make any sense. So there is always a need for knowledge transfer of what we do into our clients, and that's a pretty strong part of what we do, is teaching other people to do what we can do. So I think that's part of it. I think the second thing is that people need to do things at a reasonable rate of progress. So we do we can do it through them, which basically means we train them how to do what we do. We then get them to do the work, and we coach them from the back seat in how to do what we do. Now, that means that it increases the knowledge transfer rate to a very, very high degree, because they're learning through all the mistakes they're going to make going through the process, which is 95% of where people learn is in making mistakes, not by getting things right. Getting things right breeds arrogance in a lot of situations. So you want the people to get it wrong, to be able to learn from what does and doesn't work. They want to go through that process of getting to an end outcome in a reasonable period of time, because if that's going to take 9 months, that's too long. People will have got sort of fed up with the process by that point. So you've got to get through the process quite quickly, but also you need to do the knowledge transfer part, so hence the with you part. So we will drive things hard, but we will bring a quantity of people along with us on the journey so they can see how we got to the choices we made. Therefore, the outcome they see in terms of a price list or an operating model or whatever it is that we happen to have produced, they understand exactly how we got to those choices and why they were the right ones at that point in time.
Okay. Why do you have to close it in on 9 months? Like, why is 9 months the maximum for if something gets for that? Did I hear that correctly?
It was an arbitrary number.
Oh, it was an arbitrary number. But why? Okay, so I guess what I'm wondering is, obviously the people that want their business productized, or they want to go through this process, want to understand, and they're paying for essentially a service that allows them to fail quickly, but then have an output at the end of it, right? And you take them on that journey with them. And so it's almost like process transformation. When they're going through it, do you find that they want to revert? Like, there is that tension?
Yes.
How do you get around that? How do you teach them not to do that?
So I think there's a couple of parts to that. The first thing is that we tend to take on a client one project at a time, not try to transform the entire client in one go. If you try to transform the entire thing, you run the risk of there being enough resistance to push them back the other way, and that's kind of inevitable. Everybody loves change as long as it's affecting someone else. Nobody really likes change if it affects them. What you've got to do is find a part of the portfolio and a bunch of people who are up for change, and then take them on the journey to get them changed. Then use the proof point of that to show everybody else the way it should be done, then follow on with other pieces as you go.
Do you find typically it's with new clients, new customers, new clients, or which word am I supposed to be using here? Clients or customers?
Well, clients would be the organizations, the customers would be the people inside the organization.
Okay.
We would use those terms, yeah.
Typically, the value that the value offering, the service offering that they're producing, is that first done when you take them on that journey with new clients or existing ones?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
When you said that you've got to find the group of people and take them on that journey, and that helps validate the point that actually this is possible, do you start with new customers or do you start with existing customers with the business that the business has?
Oh, I see what you mean. You mean with their customers?
Yes, sorry.
I would start with the existing ones because the existing ones, if you make the assumption that they're not moving from being a marketing services agency to being a water cooler installer, for example, they're going to roughly stay in the same bucket of things, then you can look to the existing customers to what they've done for those clients and those customers, and use that as a benchmark of what looks reasonably productizable and that looks quite difficult and will need a bit more thought. So I would start with the existing stuff. Having access to proposals as they're going out the door does help a lot because it also sees sort of the shift, if there is any, in terms of the sorts of things they're starting to pitch for versus those things they sold previously. But I would probably start with the existing footprint because it gives you a lot of data about what sort of business they've been.
Okay. I want to talk specifically about marketing on this. When you hear I assume the most common objection you hear is you can't productize creativity, right? Like, how do you address that conversation?
Do you want to take that, Kieron?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is understanding that creativity is only part of the value that you deliver. So I think that's one of the things that, particularly creative agencies, they're very fixated on creative and the creative outcomes. And they don't think about actually the value that I'm delivering to a client is not just creative. There's value in every aspect of what you deliver as a business, including how you format your bills or how you send your bills. Every aspect of your business has a value dimension to it. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is you can still create, there's a process, the creative process is a process, right? And you can charge for that process and the process has an outcome, or maybe it has multiple outcomes, and you can charge for those outcomes. So, if you think about the introduction of AI as an example, you could differentiate in that way, right? So, yeah, you want some copy. I can generate you some copy that's produced by machine and checked by a human. Or maybe I'm producing copy that is made by a human and checked by a machine. You can differentiate between those two things in terms of the creative outputs. You could differentiate on the number of creative outputs. We will give you, and agencies do this all the time, right? We will come up with 3 creative concepts for you to choose from. Always the client says, yes, I'd like some of that, and a bit of that one. There's no, within the structure of the offering, the framework in which you deliver that, there's nothing wrong with having that productized. It doesn't mean to say that every piece of creative is the same. It's just a process.
Right. What happens to a business dependency on key people after productization then?
Hopefully, you should expect to be less dependent. What you're selling is the business process. You're not selling the people. So you should be less dependent on individuals than you are when you're selling individuals.
Do you think that's good for the business? Or do you think it increases churn, or do you think that actually it increases employee retention? Have you observed some patterns here?
I think it should be better for employee retention.
Because I remember we having that conversation, you actually increased employee satisfaction at, was it Cognified? And that obviously makes the workplace a better place to work.
Yeah, because I think one of the real problems in advertising agencies is the level of burnout, because you've got some key talent that you rely on. And what happens with key talent in agencies? Are they just left to produce work? Nope. They get involved in pitches as well. So quite often what you'll find is the key talent is expected to deliver client work and pitch at the same time. And because there's this desire to want to, pitch for as much work as possible, the key people end up becoming really burnt out because they're trying to pitch for new business, they're trying to deliver client work, and probably their name is being put to work that's actually done by a junior. So, I think it creates a quite stressful situation for some of the key talent within agencies.
Okay.
And by productizing, you shift the focus away from, you're not billing their time out anymore, right? You're billing out the outcome. So there may be things you can shift away. There may be things that you can give them more time to produce a better outcome.
So I see a lot of positives to productizing businesses. Have you had any cases where a client of yours has got cold feet midway through the implementation? I'd love to understand how you bring them back to the table and what you have to say to them to make them realize the bigger vision of what they're trying to do here.
I don't think we've had a client do that. There was certainly a circumstance within Cognified where we had one part of the portfolio where the team responsible for that part. So if we go back to the earlier story, we were talking about the sort of aftercare to support services switch. That was just one part of the portfolio. There were another sort of 5 or 6 parts to it, and one of the other teams that was responsible for one of the other parts. We went through the whole productisation process with them, and there was a lot of resistance to going through the process. They didn't like it because they felt it constrained the creative process of creating the right technical solution for a particular customer. So they tried for quite a long time to use a tool that we built. It was basically just a reasonably complex Excel spreadsheet to manage it all, but nonetheless they tried to use it, and they just eventually said, "Oh no, we don't like it. It doesn't seem to work for us. We're going to go back to the old ways of doing things." And for some projects, they went back to creating everything from scratch. The interesting aspect of all of that was after I would say about 18 months or 2 years, they asked myself and the CEO at the time to go over to meet this team because they'd had an idea.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea was basically that they was born from a problem that they'd experienced, that it was taking them longer and longer and longer to produce proposals. And this was putting an awful lot of pressure on the few people in the organisation that could produce a proposal, because now everything was being hand cranked, it was taking longer, and also the depth of experience required to produce a proposal was now very deep, because you had to know all aspects of everything to be able to get it all in your head and then convert it through time materials into a project plan and a price. So they invited us over to come and chat about this idea, and what they presented back was another level of productisation. What they wanted to do is change the items in the catalogue. They didn't get rid of the catalogue, they just wanted to rewrite the things in the catalogue, which is a standard part of product management. So I don't think you necessarily see people completely move away, but if they don't perceive the problem in the first place and don't experience the problem themselves, they can perceive it as, this sounds more complicated a solution to the problem as I experience it, and therefore I don't necessarily engage entirely and accept entirely the answer.
Okay.
What I think is fair to say is, once you leave them for a little while to experience the world they've created for themselves with all its complexity, they suddenly feel the need to go back towards where they just came from and say, oh, actually what I need is some sort of catalogue I can select things from to make my own life easier. It was one of those situations, there's that thing about you can only help people who want to be helped. And I think that's true in almost all circumstances, that if someone is highly resistant to change, it doesn't really matter how hard you try, they're still going to resist it. Sometimes you're better off just letting them alone for a little while, let them sit in whatever situation they're in, come to their own conclusion about what good looks like, and then typically they'll re-engage at that point.
So essentially what you're telling me, Andrew, is your whole business is to put doubt in someone's head, let them create a world for them, and then let them sit in that world so that they can come back to you and be like, I don't like this. Can you help, please?
I don't think that's quite how I characterise it. I think it's more that, there are some people, there have been some clients, well, not clients actually, some prospects we've spoken to, who have come along with very, very explicit problems. This isn't working and that isn't working. And you present them the answers and you say, well, there is path A, path B, or path C. Which one would you like? And they go, well, none of them are acceptable. And you go, well, you've set out the constraints. These are the constraints you want to live in. It's A, B, or C. Which would you like? And they go, no, I don't want any of them. Put them back out to pasture. Let them. You can't help those people because they're not ready to be helped. And I think that's the fairest thing to do for them, is because otherwise it turns into an argument. And frankly, business is not about winning arguments; it's about solving problems. If they don't want their problems solved, that's okay. Let them...
Is there a specific metric that you show them, like at the end of all of this, where you go, look, this is working now? Is it revenue? Is it marginal revenue? Is it employee satisfaction? What's the one that you hold on to and at the end of an engagement look at and say, we've achieved success here?
I think it's very dependent on the customer and what the problem was we were starting with, or what the opportunity looks like. For some, it will be revenue growth, for sure, right? You sold more, and that could be you've sold more to new customers. It could be you've sold more to existing customers by cross-selling and upselling. So I think that's highly dependent on that. In other cases, it's going to be driven by margin. We've been delivering this way, we've now flipped it over delivering that way, and therefore they've seen an increase in margin. Kieron, any particular metrics you'd be pulling out?
Oh, I think the metrics, as always, it's down to what they're trying to achieve as a business. It's always there's always a lot of focus on the end outcomes, but actually your ability to change things, or the things you can manage, are the things that happened before then. And so the real skill is identifying what the critical factors are before you get to the result. It's my analogy about playing a game of rugby. It's not saying we're just going to score more points than the opposition. It's measuring what are the aspects of your play that you want to improve on that will drive that outcome.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd love to just, in the last 10 minutes of our conversation, have some personal insights and closing thoughts. One of the questions that came to mind that I've been thinking of as we've been having our discussion is, what's the biggest misconception when you first started A Few Good People helping businesses productize? What is that large misconception that you had?
I think for us, we had done this in the world of agencies. So we'd come from a product background in IT and telecoms. And then when we moved into agencies, we saw that there was tons of opportunity to really improve the way that things were done. We did that in the agencies that we worked for. We kind of started A Few Good People with the intent of bringing the things that we learned to other agencies. I think probably the thing that we didn't realize is that a lot of agencies either don't recognize the problem or don't want to change. And I think what we've found is we've done a lot of work that we didn't intend to do.
It's okay, we'll edit it out, don't worry.
Sorry, that was my grandmother walking past.
That's okay.
I've forgotten where I was now.
The question was, what was your biggest misconception when you first started helping businesses productize?
Yeah, so our biggest, it was really that we thought that agencies wanted to change and that they would be willing to change. And I think what we've discovered is that a lot of them either don't recognize that there's a problem when there is, or they're unwilling to change and they want to carry on doing the same thing. So I think we've found that a lot of the clients that we've won have not been agencies.
Interesting. Andrew?
I think the biggest misconception that I had was probably, it's sort of related, but it's the relatively poor understanding of product and product management.
I'm so sorry. The water went down the wrong way.
You all right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Andrew. I feel like I'm dying right now. Sorry. Can I ask that question again? It was a series of events that just happened very quickly.
Unfortunate events.
So, a series of unfortunate events. Great book. Great series. What about you, Andrew?
I think probably it's the fairly widespread misunderstanding about what product management is about and productization. The more I see people writing about product owners, product managers, product management, the more it's pretty obvious that most people don't really understand what it's about. And as a consequence, when we start talking to them, we need to reset their expectations about what we mean by that. Even this morning, someone posted very kindly on LinkedIn that I'd helped them because they'd been a product manager, product director, in fact, and had only really been focused on the sort of technical aspect of product management. through conversations we'd had and work we'd done with them, they'd seen the whole other side of it, which is all about sort of commercial management, psychology of product, all these sorts of things, which they'd not really experienced before. So I think particularly in the agency space, because there are digital products, which are in essence just the technical aspect of product management, that whole commercial angle of pricing and positioning and all those sorts of things is an unknown to many of those people in that space.
Throughout this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that the businesses you work with, a lot of the onus is on them to actually come together and buy in, right? You need not just an individual, but you need a whole company buy-in. The individuals or the leaders have to be particularly successful at doing something like that, right? What patterns have you observed of the businesses you work with implementing productization? Like, those characters, what do they have in them?
That's a really good question. I'd need to have a bit of a think about that. I think there's definitely an aspect of...
I got one with Andrew. One where he had to think about it. I love it.
I think there's a lot of... I think it comes back to what Kieron said. They've been open-minded enough to realise something isn't quite right and they need to ask for some help. Which, when you're running your own business, is not necessarily the easiest of things to admit to. So I think that's probably the key thing is, and it was true at Cognify. They were quite open about the fact, well, we don't know anything about this space, so can you come in and sort it out because we don't know what to do with it. I think the more you meet people like that, the more chance there is for organisations like us to be able to help.
Yeah, I think it's people who, they need to be open-minded enough to think about a different way of doing things. I think there are people who, maybe they acknowledge that maybe there's an issue that needs resolving, or they think that, there's, they've heard about productization and they think it can be right, but at the end of the day, they're just not open-minded enough to be able to make the changes required to make it happen. And I think the people who do it well are the ones who are prepared to think in different ways. And I think it's kind of one of the great ironies when we think about agencies. I think it's one of the great ironies that for organizations that talk about creativity and talk about thinking outside the box and everything else, they can be very set in their ways.
Final question. If you could make one prediction about the way that service businesses operate 10 years from now, what would that be? Do you think they're all productized? Do you think that there are different business models? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think a lot of service organizations today that are not productized will be productized. And I think technology will be one of the big drivers behind that, because I think there will be a lot of low-value stuff that will be done by AI that is currently being done by humans, and that will force that kind of change. Because if your business model relies on charging for humans and you're not using humans, something's got to give.
Andrew?
I think it'll be a mixture of different business models. What those may be, I'm not entirely sure just yet. At the moment, even the AI companies aren't doing anything particularly unique in the commercial space. They've all come up with some points-based model for you get 100 points tracked in, and therefore you can ask these sorts of AI models certain types of questions, and it will burn points as you do so. I think it's a bit difficult to forecast exactly what would happen in the different sectors. There's a new book out by an organisation that's sort of parallel to us who focuses much more explicitly on the legal industry, and they're saying an awful lot of the legal industry will move into non-time oriented charging models. What those models may be, still to be determined, but time is definitely not going to be one of the key factors.
On the topic of time, gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for it. I hope we get to do this again.
Love it. Yep. Thank you very much, Viraj.
Thanks for your really great questions, Viraj.
Yep, really.
I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun putting this together. Thanks, guys.